So good afternoon. My name is Graham Goulden, and today I am delighted to welcome a good friend of mine, Dr. Jackson Katz. Welcome, Jackson, to this conversation.
Thanks, Graham. It's great to be with you. This is great.
Tell us a bit about, why did you develop MVP? And tell us what it is, and tell us why you developed the program.
Sure, and I think you've done fantastic work, Graham, in Scotland and the UK with taking the MVP model and adapting it and promoting it, and it's just a great thing, and I'm grateful to you and to your colleagues for really sort of seizing the moment and making MVP happen in Scotland. I mean, there's a lot to it, but I'll try to be as concise as I can be. When I started the MVP program back in 1993 at an institute in Boston called the Center for the Study of Sport in Society, the idea was, how do we get more men to start speaking up about the issues of sexual assault and domestic violence and sexual harassment and all that range of issues that historically had been considered women's issues. And my passion from the time I was a young man was, we need to get more men involved in this conversation. We need to start changing definitions of manhood. And I thought the sports culture was an important arena, if you will, or an important place to have that conversation, because sports is so was influential in my life. And part of the reason why I felt so confident that I could make a difference was I had been successful in sports culture. And I thought, well, why not, if it's working for me, if I have doors are opening to me, people want to hear what I have to say because I was a good football player. Well, the doors are going to open to other men. So let's figure out how to make this a routine sort of part of being a sports, being an athlete. Training on these issues and leverage the status of student athletes. Like in the States, university student athletes are very popular, have a different platform and enhanced status within their larger university culture. I know it's different than the UK, but it was certainly an important place. It still is in the States. And I knew about the work of this institute that was trying to figure out ways to use sport as the vehicle for social justice. And we know that that's an incredibly important thing in the 20th and 21st century. And whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement getting all kinds of energy from Colin Kaepernick's, taking a knee, to try to call attention to police violence against African-American men. And now it's blowing up as a, global sort of phenomenon. But sports was an important part of that. Sports was an important part of the resistance to apartheid in South Africa. There's so many examples. And I knew all of this. And women's sports is an incredible thing. Women's sports is an incredibly important part of women's gaining equal status and equal rights in societies around the world. I knew all of this. So when I started the MVP program, it was like trying to leverage the power of athletics, especially male athletics, to get more men to speak up. And we did it, and we started it, and we were the first program, the MVP program, to employ what's called the Bystander Approach, and to sexual assault and relationship abuse prevention. And basically, the way that came about was I had a professor in graduate school who, along with his colleagues, his name was Ron Slavey, was looking at an approach to middle school bullying prevention that moved beyond the perpetrator-victim binary. In other words, instead of focusing on the kid doing the bullying or the kid experiencing it, they focused on all the kids around the kid doing it and all the kids around the kid experiencing it. And the goal was to get everybody around the kid doing the bullying to make it clear to that person that what he or she is doing is not okay, not just because they're harming one person, but because all the other people in the group disapproved and said, this is not cool, and this is not the way you treat people in our group, and we're going to make it clear to you. And the goal was to get the kids around the kid experiencing it to say, look, what can we do to help you? This is wrong, what's happening to you, and we're on your side, what can we do? The beauty of that was that it brought everybody into the conversation. It didn't just isolate it to the perpetrator and the victim. So what we did is, in the sexual assault field and domestic violence and relationship abuse field, is we would say to men and young men, look, even if you yourself don't abuse girls or women, if you don't say anything, if you don't challenge and interrupt your friends and your peers and your mates and your buddies who are abusing girls or women, or telling jokes and making negative comments and derogatory comments about women and women's bodies, if you don't make it clear that you're not cool with that, then in a sense, your silence is a form of consent and complicity in their abuse. And what that did was it gave us a way to talk to the vast majority of men and young men who will say, this isn't my issue. I don't rape women. I don't harass my girls. I don't abuse my girlfriend or my wife. And we could say to those guys, wait a second, that's not enough. Okay, I'm glad you don't, but that's not enough. You have to do more. You have to make it clear to the guys around you that they can't participate in that kind of behavior either, on a whole spectrum. And that was the bystander approach as it was applied to these issues. And MVP took it from the sports culture, and then we moved into the military, and we've been working since 1997. We started in 1997 with the United States Marine Corps, and it's a challenge. I mean, the U.S. Department of Defense is a giant organization, and it's very difficult to maintain and sustain programming and changes that happen over time. But we've been working with the DoD, United States Department of Defense, since 1997. And my goal was always to get the MVP program into high schools all over the United States, universities, but also high schools, and then even younger, middle schools. But the term mentor in Mentors in Violence Prevention, as you know, is critical, because the idea wasn't to get some adult, middle-aged intellectual coming into the schools and giving a lecture to kids. It was to train slightly older kids to use their status, their slightly older sort of, their knowledge and their wisdom and their mentorship, if you will, to influence the younger kids. And so we would train older high school students to work with younger high school students. We would train high school kids to work with what we call middle school kids. It's a mentoring relationship. And the idea is you don't have to be an expert to teach this material, to facilitate it. You just need to be somebody who says, we need to be having a conversation here, and we need to be talking about, real life situations. What do you do? What would I do? What would you do? And obviously I've been talking about the men's side of it and the young men and boys side of it, but MVP became very quickly, after it was initially all male, it became very quick, quickly mixed gender, because a lot of women in the athletic programs we were working with would say, okay, and the coaches would say, look, this is great, but young women have to have a role too. And so we said, oh, sure, let's do it. And so we figured out a way to use the same concept, which is the bystander concept. If you yourself aren't the victim or the target of harassment, or you're not the perpetrator or the abuser, but you are in a peer culture, what can you do to challenge, to interrupt, to support? Everybody has a role to play. And again, the beauty of it is that it's inclusive and aspirational and positive, because what we're saying is the bystander, and I use the word bystander as a synonym for friend, teammate, classmate, colleague, or coworker. In the workplace, it's colleague or coworker. There's really no such thing as a bystander, really. It's just another way of saying another person in the peer culture. But the person who speaks up, like, for example, the 15-year-old boy who hears his friend tell a rape joke, who turns to his friend and says, dude, that's not funny. Can you joke about something else? I don't really like jokes about rape. That boy is actually acting as a leader in that moment. He might not see himself as a leader. He might not have any credentials to suggest that he's achieved a certain status as a leader, but that act of saying that's not funny is a leadership act, because he's seen a problem and he has the courage and the strength and the self-confidence to, instead of walking away or pretending he didn't hear it, is to say, you know what, I'm going to do something. I'm going to say something. And by framing the empowered bystander as a leader, you're framing it in a positive and aspirational way for boys and men. Because I think a lot of boys and men have historically heard some of these conversations about domestic and sexual violence as, you better not do it. You better stop treating women badly. And I think a lot of guys get defensive and they shut down. And so what we do with MVP is very different, which is we come in and we challenge them in a positive way. And we say, look, we can do better than this, can't we? And we need more young men or young women who have the courage and the strength to say, you're not going to do this in my name. And I'm not going to be silent in the face of this. And it doesn't mean that I'm soft. In fact, it means that I'm a person of integrity who has the courage of my convictions. And I'm not going to just walk away and pretend I didn't see what I just saw.
I think that's a really, MVP is such a fantastic program, and you've just described, I think a lot of people, when they hear bystander program, they think all we're doing is teaching people to overcome the bystander effect and move from the passive to the active. It's so much more than that. It's about culture. It's about you know, where intervention becomes the norm, where it's normal for me to say to my friend, hey, not cool, that's not right. And that's what I want people to really start to think about with MVP. It's about having this anti-violence message. It's about building the team. You know, we have more in common than which divides us, was the quote from the MP that was sadly murdered a few years ago in this country, Joe Cox. And it's about bringing that healthy norm. I sometimes think that we don't use pro-social norms enough. You know, in our classrooms, we have groups of young men with lovely values, with good attitudes, with good belief systems, who don't commit abuse. But we need to understand why they don't intervene in situations. And what MVP does for me, it helps boys discuss these issues. It creates conversations. And you're right, it's not we don't aim to create experts. You know, I love watching young people just step up and talk about bullying, sexual violence, hate crime, whatever. How are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do? And we also give young people the opportunity to practice what they would do, what they would say to a friend who is a victim or a friend who is the problem. And that's something which I think is really, really important and helps us have that anti-violence message that I think is needed in our schools. You know, what would your advice be to a school just starting off or starting off developing their MVP model? What would your advice be?
Well, you have to have the buy-in and the commitment on the part of the leadership in that school. And if you have the buy-in on the part of the administrators and some key teachers and coaches and others, you can change the whole school culture very quickly if you have the buy-in. I mean, the kids are going to get with it. Kids, as you know from your experience and your colleagues in Scotland, kids really like this. Kids really like the opportunity to have conversations. They're not going to agree with each other all the time, and not every kid is going to become, super mentor, obviously. But kids like the opportunity to have honest conversations about subjects that matter. So if the adults, if you will, the professional educators are committed to doing this and making this happen, the kids will be. That's not the hard part. The hard part is getting the buy-in of the adults. The kids are into it very quickly, I think, in my experience and in your experience. And by the way, another factor, Graham, I think it's important to acknowledge is that there's all kinds of racial and ethnic diversity in the UK and the United States, and MVP integrates all of that in our model. In other words, there are subcultural differences, there are religious differences, and obviously racial and ethnic differences, but there's a lot that unites us as well around these matters. And domestic and sexual violence and gender violence more generally are all issues that cut across all those categories. They're categories in wealthy white community. I mean, they're problems in wealthy white communities and poor communities of color and everyone in between. And there's all kinds of new sort of opportunities, I think, for incredible dialogue crossing some of these categories, that you can organize a conversation about violence and violence prevention, even across all those cultural and racial and ethnic differences. And we do it all the time. And we've been doing it in MVP from the beginning. You can do it. And because what you're doing is you're stimulating dialogue. You're aligning yourself with a basic principle, which is abuse, harassment, and violence is wrong, especially around gender-based issues and sexual-based issues, but also racial violence and ethnic discrimination. Like, for example, if we're teaching people to speak up in the face of injustice, it's not just about sexual violence or domestic violence. If a young white person, for example, is going through MVP training, and then he or she finds himself in a situation where he's with a group of white people, and one or two of those white people start making racist comments, if he or she is anything, if the education has worked, they're not going to just be silent. They're going to say, look, that's not cool. Making racist comments is not cool. There's a relationship between racist comments and racist violence, just like there's a relationship between normalizing sexist comments, men making degrading comments about girls or women, and men's violence against them. These are all related.
Yeah.
And the MVP model allows us to have these broader conversations.
Yeah, I think you highlight a point there about this, that these acts of physical violence, these explosions of physical violence or sexual violence or homophobic hate violence, they don't just happen. They take place within a culture, but also on a continuum of violence. That's something we talk a lot in MVP. We're not working with young people to jump into knife fights or to physical fights. It's the comments, it's the language, it's the words, it's the the joking that goes on that's often excused as having a laugh or a bit of banter, is the phrase we use here in Scotland or in the UK. And that's where we want people. That's to have the courage to sort of step in at that point.
Graham, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to make sure that I said this. I wrote a piece that was published in the States in Ms. Magazine about the Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. And as soon as I heard about this case, and then I watched the video, it became clear to me that this is a classic scenario. You had 3 fellow officers who were in a position to stop Derek Chauvin from ultimately murdering George Floyd, but they didn't. And then a lot of people in the public were saying, and certainly in the social protest movement, were saying, these guys need to be arrested. These guys need to be held accountable for, for murder, et cetera. And immediately I thought, okay, this is a classic situation. What was going on in the dynamic of those 4 people? And if you do a little more, dive into the facts of the case, it turns out that 2 of them were rookie officers. One of them was in his 4th day on the job. 4th day on the job. One of them was an African-American guy. And by the way, Derek Chauvin, the guy who's charged with murder, is a training officer and who's got 19 years of experience on the force. And so he comes in with great authority into that situation, with great authority, with sort of, alpha male, I'm the guy, I'm the man kind of thing. He's the trainer. One guy's on his 4th day on the job. And if you think those dynamics aren't important, I mean, people who think that those dynamics aren't important don't really understand what's going on in peer cultures, in male peer cultures, because this happens all the time. Guys see things. Forget about police culture for a moment. Just think about groups of guys hanging out, young guys hanging out. Guys see other guys acting in ways that they know are wrong and they don't approve of, and they know the guy sitting here watching the other guy, act, knows that, if my mother saw me, if my girlfriend saw me, if my father saw me, he wouldn't be happy, but I'm not going to say anything, because if I say something now, I'm going to get, it's going to be awkward and it's going to cause problems in my relationship with these guys. He could turn on me. It could be, and this is definitely true in police culture, by the way, because guys know that there's a certain loyalty, to the blue shield kind of thing. And if you somehow challenge, especially in public when people have video cameras rolling, if you're challenging another officer, you're taking a risk that you're going to get lots of pushback that you stepped out of line because you were supposed to back your guy, but this happens in normal peer cultures that have nothing to do with, hierarchies in police forces. And so guys make calculations all the time. I'm not going to say something because if I say something, it's not going to go well. And I'm not willing right now to put my job on the line or my friendships on the line. And people tell themselves stories like it's not really that big a deal anyways. In other words, if those guys, those 3 men who were charged with being accomplices to murder, if they could roll the tape back, don't you think they would have taken the risk? If they could know that how it played out, don't you think they would have taken the risk? And by the way, one of them did take a small risk. He was trying to get the Derek Chauvin to have George Floyd flip over on his side, so he didn't not say anything. But clearly, those guys were in a position where they could have changed history if they had the courage, the strength, and the self-confidence.
Yeah, I watched that film. Like a lot of people watching this have watched that George Floyd incident, and whilst a lot of people are watching that main police officer and unfortunately and George Floyd himself, like you, I was watching the police officers around that, and that was my focus on the bystanders. Why are they not? And bystanders are often seen as the co-conspirator, as part of the problem, and we need to take a step back and understand all these dynamics that you talk about. And that's what I love about the MVP program is you highlight a bystander is a friend, it's a colleague, it's a teammate. It's someone I know. It's a circle of friends, and it's about if I am a really good friend or a good teammate or a good work colleague, I need to do something here because something's going to happen to my friend. I need to get my mate away from the situation. In Scotland we have a conviction rate for rape and sexual assault in single figures, but we know that many bystanders see the build up to these situations in the nightclub and the bars, and that needs to be the focus. And we can't just give people the tools to intervene. We need to give men the space to overcome. I don't fear my friends punching me in the face if I challenge their behaviour, but I might fear my friend isolating me. I think you call it a social fear, Jackson. You use that phrase, a social fear. So I think, thank you for that sort of discussion around the challenges that we still have in society, the complexities of violence. You know, violence is this wicked problem. It, you know, if you focus on one area, it will change shape and go elsewhere. And I think you've highlighted well the need. We've got this big discussion in the United States just now around the Washington Redskins, not only around the logo, but around the sexual harassment and sexual violence that's just been uncovered and talked about in the last few days. We have some universities in this country who are now their names all over the paper because of sexual harassment, sexual violence claims coming forward. And you've highlighted the need for leadership to grasp these issues and start to think about, what do I need to be doing to talk about culture, developing leadership, not just, you know, talking about consent, but it's about developing leadership amongst the staff, but also the population, the student population or the team themselves. And I know you work in, having worked with MVP in sports, I know that's something that you do. But I think it's, you know, this conversation, I could go on and have loads of conversations, but I'm aware of time is coming short. Just to really bring this conversation to a close, Jackson, I don't want to read the final comment for the mentors. These are the young people you've touched on that are going out and delivering MVP sessions to these young people and with their peers. Go and shout out to the MVP mentors in the UK now, not just in Scotland, but in the UK. What would you want to say to them?
Well, I think what they're doing is great. I mean, I think it's like the world desperately needs, you know, I'm young people, and I'm a person who was a formerly young person who was an activist when I was a young guy, and full of like energy of like change is possible. You know, there is transformation is possible. You don't have to just accept, you know, what we've been, you know, sort of given, if you will. It's our role as humans, and, you know, in an evolutionary sense, to adapt to new circumstances and to move ahead. And I think so young people have an incredible opportunity. That society, like in UK right now, is way more racially and ethnically diverse than it ever was, certainly when I was growing up. And I'm an American, but I know that the UK has gone through lots of changes. Women have made enormous advances. We don't have gender equality or sexual equality, but women have made, because men are still in control, and there's still a male dominant culture in the UK and in, you know, the United States and virtually everywhere else. But women have made enormous strides. But young people have an incredible role to play, and people who are committed, like people who sign up to be part of the MVP model and to be mentors, can transform not just other people's lives, but their own lives. And they can be, you know, these are life skills that are lifelong. And I always say this, like we're not just training young people, like in the high schools or at the universities, to be preventing violence around them, and that's all. We're helping them develop life skills to be leaders, to be strong people who can function in their families, in their communities, in their workplaces going forward. But again, this is really an institutional question, because until the institutions buy into the need to address these issues forthrightly and upfront, the changes aren't going to happen on the scale that they have to happen. And I over the last number of years, the scandals that have come about in workplaces, for example, in the UK, but also in the States, you know, sexual harassment scandals in one workplace after another, including high profile, whether it's professional athletics or in the tech industry or in Wall Street. I mean, these are enormous scandals that keep happening. And obviously they're happening because there's sort of norms that have been sustained over time, over decades, that haven't been changed effectively. And yet we know so much. We can change those norms, but the front edge, I mean, the politics of this and the institutional buy-in that's necessary all ends up relying on, ultimately, the young people who are going through these systems and who are going to use their power to affect change today and tomorrow, and, you know, and going down the road. And I would say, carry on and come up with new ideas. If you don't think that the ideas that you're hearing are as responsive as they need to be to the reality of your situation, well, come up with new ideas, you know, build on our ideas and go to the next step. I also want to say, Graham, this is not directly responding to, you know, MVP program or MVP mentors. But I think it's important to have a larger sort of political understanding what's going on, because in Europe and the United States, there has been a growth of a sort of white nationalist movements and, you know, and white supremacist movements and neo-Nazi movements in the heart of Europe, as well as in the United States over the past number of years. And you know who the heart of that movement, those movements are? It's young white men. It's young white men who, instead of dealing with increasing ethnic and racial diversity and gender equality in a way that adapting in a positive way and saying, this is great, Europe is changing, the UK is changing, America is changing, I'm going to be part of it. They've hunkered down in a defensive crouch and an aggressive crouch. I'm going to defend my turf. I'm going to defend white power. I'm going to be the man in my family and my community who stands at the barricades and stops all this change from happening. And you know where that leads. It leads to the death camps. It leads to the 50 million people dead in World War II, because that's exactly, young German men were being trained in the 20s and 30s to, you know, Germany's been humiliated. We need to come back from this. We need to be strong. I mean, some of the same rhetoric that caused the greatest debacle in human history in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And by the way, my long deceased father and stepfather both fought in the United States Army in World War II, in France and Germany. And my father was a medic in the United States Army in Germany and France. We know where this leads. It leads nowhere good. And if you want to tie this back into the MVP discussion, I'll give you an example of how that can tie in. We need more young white guys in the UK and in the United States and in Europe more broadly, who are willing to resist the appeal of fascism and of hunkering down and hyper-masculine, kind of aggressive, violent, racist, kind of sexist way, and say, I'm going to be strong, but I'm going to be strong in the service of justice. I'm going to be strong, and I'm going to use my strength in the service of equality and lifting people up and welcoming people in, not in a defensive crouch that becomes aggressive and tries to prevent people from exercising their human rights. And I think if we have more young people in the UK and in the United States who are willing to take that positive stance, then we have a chance at obviously defeating and marginalizing these movements, which are obviously very, very worrying at this moment in history. But I believe that they're also a minority movement. In other words, there's a small number who have made a lot of headlines, and if you will, and gotten a lot of attention, but they don't really represent the majority. But if the majority doesn't speak, if young people and young men and young white men remain silent and say, I'm not going to get involved with any of this, then in a sense, their silence gives too much power to their peers. And I always say, if I as a white man don't speak up against racism and against sexism and heterosexism, then the white guys who are racist and sexist and heterosexist come to speak for me. And I don't want those guys speaking for me. And the only way that I can prevent them from speaking for me is by speaking for myself. And if we can encourage men, especially, to join with women, to join with their female peers, and struggle together. And it's complicated and it's going to be messy. And I'm not saying that it isn't. It is. But face their fear in a positive way and make mistakes, but pick yourself up and keep going. Then I think we have some hope. And I think those people who are involved in MVP, it's not the only program in the world, but it's one of the programs that can structure this kind of activism in a way that's productive and useful. And I'm my hat's off to them.
Yeah, I think this Generation Z, that's what we call them. They are the activist generation, and I really think that MVP will give them a way to continue that activism. And you're right, we are, this is about empowering the majority of young people, the majority of men to stand up against these issues. And that's what I think MVP does. It builds the team. So building the team in schools and workplaces and universities, sports teams, wherever. So listen, Jackson, thank you for that conversation. That last little bit reminded me of the Lieutenant General Morrison, the standard you walk past, the standard you accept. Big part of MVP, a big part of your bystander approach that you talk about, how Morrison really articulates that, we need to step up, but remind ourselves that if we don't step up, what are we saying? What are we saying to the small number of people who do commit abuse and violence? So listen, thank you, Jackson, for that conversation. Thank you for giving your time today to talk to us about your work. And I've really enjoyed, I learn every time I talk to you, I learn something differently and new about you, but also about this work. And again, thank you for giving me that opportunity. 10 years ago, I've known you for 10 years now. And so all those years ago we met, and you've really given me lots of opportunities and lots of good knowledge. So thank you for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks for all your continuing great work. It's great to work with you and to be friends with you.
Good. Thank you.